환영사 정은찬 한반도미래연구원 이사장. 안녕하십니까. 한반도미래연구원 이사장 정은찬입니다. 한반도미래연구원을 대표하여 이번 해외석학 초청 심포지움에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 인구는 경제, 사회, 문화 등 우리나라를 지탱하는 모든 부분에서 가장 핵심적인 요소입니다. 무엇보다도 우리나라는 양질의 인적 자원을 투입하여 성장해온 국가입니다. 그러나 출산율 저하와 이에 따른 인구의 감소는 우리나라 성장의 심각한 위협 요인으로 작용하고 있습니다. 실제로 생산 가능 인구 감소에 따라 우리나라 잠재 성장률은 2050년에 0.5%까지 떨어질 것으로 전망되고 있습니다. 국제 정망 비교에서도 우리나라 출산율과 함께 잠재 성장률은 매번 최하위에 위치하고 있습니다. 그러나 우리가 손을 놓고만 있었던 것은 아니었습니다. 우리나라 정부는 2006년부터 16년간 280조 원이라는 천문학적 규모의 예산을 저출산을 해결하는 데 투입했습니다. 그러나 모두 아시다시피 우리나라 저출산 정책의 결과는 합계 출산율 0.78명이라는 OECD 최하위 성적표이며 우리는 이것을 성공이라 말하지 않습니다. 저출산 문제를 우리나라 내부에서 진단하기 어렵다면 세계적 관점에서 다시 저출산 문제를 바라볼 필요가 있습니다. 오늘 콜만 교수님의 강의는 우리가 놓쳤거나 보지 못했던 저출산 문제에 대한 색다르고 훌륭한 시각을 제공해 줄 것입니다. 그리고 토론을 통해 우리나라 저출산 문제에 대한 실제적이고 깊은 논의가 오늘 심포지움에서 이루어지기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
오늘 회의를 영어로 진행하는 것으로 있기 때문에 제 인사 말씀부터 영어로 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to serve as a moderator this morning and once again welcome all the distinguished participants and audience in this room. First of all, I would like to thank Professor David Coleman for accepting our invitation to share his thoughts on the low fertility in Korea and the challenges we face today. It's been a while and I'm very much pleased to see you in good health throughout the pandemic. And my appreciation also goes to all of those who have made today's symposium possible. As we all know, Korea recently witnessed even further decline in fertility. The total fertility rate hit a record low of 0.78 last year, and working age population has already begun to decline since 2017, and the total population of Korea has started to decline since last year. There have been many various arguments and discussions about the ultra-low fertility and the negative impact of shrinking population and labor force in Korean society. Well, we cannot overemphasize the importance of diagnosing the challenges we face today, formulating population goals and targets, and making concerted efforts by all sectors of society to achieve them. This morning, we gathered here to listen to Professor Coleman's diagnosis of the Korean fertility situation from a global perspective, his prospects for the future, and policy implications of the European experience for Korean society. Well, our speaker this morning does not need my long introduction. Just briefly, David Coleman is an emeritus professor at the University of Oxford and Associate Fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. He served as a professor of demography at St. John's College, Oxford until 2013. His research interest covers demographic transition, social policy issues, and ethnic minority demographic behaviors, and so on. He has published over 90 papers and eight books, and Professor Coleman is an international scholar of repute and has been praised as the public face of British population studies. I don't know whether he will agree with me, but we also have two outstanding panelists today, Professor Bong Oge from Kookmin University and Dr. Ka Hyung Ho from National Assembly Budget Office. Professor Ge is one of the most active demographers and has worked on a wide range of topics related to fertility and population. And Dr. Ho oversees the Population and Strategy Analysis Division at the National Assembly Budget Office. Dr. Ge and Dr. Ho, thank you very much for joining this symposium this morning. Let me just say a few words about the time management of this symposium. David, I would like to ask you to finish your presentation in about 30 minutes. That'll be okay. And after the presentation, two assigned discussants will have 15 minutes each for comment and questions, which will be followed by the speaker's response and Q&A session with the floor audience. Simultaneous interpretation service will be provided for those who wish comment or ask questions from the floor. Okay? That's about it. I'll do my best to proceed according to the timetable in the announcement and finish everything by noon today. Okay, we now move on to Professor Coleman's presentation. As you see in the announcement, the title of his lecture is Korea and its Birth Rate, with the subtitle Herald of a Shrinking World or Unique Special Case. Please join me in welcoming Professor Coleman.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful to you for coming to listen to me. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this meeting and to Professor Do-Sub Kim for so very kindly inviting me to speak to you on this fundamentally important topic, which is of interest to all of us, because Korea is just the herald of a worldwide trend towards lower birth rates and population decline, which is going to affect us all to a greater or a lesser degree. Can I start by saying something humble? It is extraordinarily important when someone is invited to address the citizens of another country about some problem which they're experiencing, to be extremely cautious about suggesting what they ought to do in order to solve problems on which they are much better informed than the person who is speaking, that is to say, me. And so I do this in all humility. Nonetheless, it is important, I think, if I'm going to be of any use at all, to say things which, although they only come from an ignorant outsider, nonetheless may be useful, but they may be useful by being possibly rather maybe even offensive and possibly rude. That is not my intention. But if I'm going to be useful, I have to say what I think, however wrong that may be. And I have, as you see here, a confession to make, because I have come across nothing that I have thought myself, which I have not already seen in the writings of the academics and experts and specialists here in Korea and in other countries outside. I do not bring salvation like some kind of redeeming angel. And also a warning, I think it's the fourth time that I've been to Korea. Each time I come, the birth rate goes down. I hope this will not follow this current visit. The question of population decline is one which has seized the imagination of journalists and writers throughout the educated world. There are lots and lots and lots of books forecasting population doom through population decline and extinction, in just the same way as there were and still are books forecasting population doom as arising out of population growth in the poorer parts of the world. And the problem is, of course, as we all know, you can have several problems at once. The reality is that in some parts of the world, particularly the poorest, the birth rate is still high. In Niger, the ladies of Niger still want to have about 7 children and still have about 7 children. Whereas in Korea, at the other end of the developmental scale, as you know, the birth rate's not even equivalent to 1 child per woman. So you have these two problems at once: the additional prospect of about 3 billion more people on the planet at a time of global climate change and serious problems of resource availability, while at the same time a greater and greater part of the world's population is in decline and is not replacing itself. In my view, the question of population decline is inevitable and in the long run desirable, as long as it is slow and managed and as long as it comes to an end, because the climate changes taking place in the world and also resource problems mean that an increasingly large part of the world's surface is not going to be inhabitable by human beings at times in the future. We must keep this very firmly in mind. It is not perhaps a question which troubles Korea very much, but it certainly troubles other parts of the world. This is the current reality in East Asia. As I've been saying earlier on this morning, it's of great interest to me that a number of countries in East Asia are behaving in rather similar ways from the point of view of total fertility. Here we have Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan and Japan, all starting from rather different but high starting points of the birth rate and converging to universally damagingly low levels of reproduction. This goes up to the year 2022 with Korea at the bottom, as you see from this graph. There's been much talk of population extinction. Yes, there has been a projection for Korea suggesting that there will be no more Koreans after 2750. This is something which I have not been able to see in detail. I can't understand why not. But there's a very similar projection for Japan, with Korea slightly in the lead, but Japan down to the last Japanese by the year 3000. And this is a graph from an official Japanese government website, which must be the most pessimistic government projection ever put on the web at any time at all, showing the decline of the population in the blue line, but the stabilization of the age structure, important to notice, which is the red line, albeit at a very unfavorable level. I don't take this too seriously. I have no doubt that the ingenuity and political wisdom of the Korean and Japanese and other people and their governments will overcome these problems in due course. And it takes a long time for a country to be destroyed. The great economist Adam Smith said that there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, meaning that it takes an awful lot of damage before it finally succumbs. I'm sure that is true of these countries. I was asked to look at 5 questions. And these are they with 5 blunt responses in response to them. One, can we overcome the issue of low fertility? It seems to me that is still uncertain. If I knew the answers to that and how to do it, then I would deserve a Nobel Prize, and I don't. What I think is certain is that economic measures alone are not going to do the trick. Can immigration policy solve low fertility? Only in terms of numbers, not in terms of age structure. It's a Ponzi scheme to be very cautious of, if you wish to remain Korean, that is. How did European countries solve this? Well, we haven't. We haven't partly because we haven't had the same problem, and partly because where we have had the same problem, it has not been solved, only managed, and often not deliberately. It seems to me that the perspective we should address or look at in this context is to see what the more successful countries do, and see if anything there can be copied or developed, and what is obviously harmful in the very low fertility countries can be avoided. This is very obvious, and this is something like almost everything else which has been very clearly set out by Korean demographers themselves, and doesn't need outsiders like me to say so. Private corporations. This is something unfamiliar to me, because in my country, private corporations have nothing to do with the birth rate, and aren't aware of it, pay no attention to it, and pursue their business interests. I know in Korea things are different because of the chaebol system and the close collaboration between great corporations and the government. But generally speaking, it seems to me that the way that corporations contribute, maybe I'd say so, is to take the pressure off of intensive working, do things which they will not want to do, because they will reduce output, they will reduce productivity, they will reduce profits and income, but nonetheless they may allow Korean people to lead what you might call a rather more humane way of life, which may encourage the production of children and not just of goods and services. No, yes, sensible to look at measurement. Demography, as you know, its lifeblood is accurate measurement of a meaningful measurement of demographic phenomena. We ought to make sure we've got it right, and that we aren't frightening ourselves too much by looking at indicators which are misleading us as to the seriousness of the situation. For example, a notion still persists of there being a normal retirement age, an age of entitlement to pensions at age 65. Increasingly throughout the world, this is becoming quite obsolete, because improvements in expectation of life mean that people are capable of working way beyond age 65 and do so. And if people are surviving for that length of time beyond age 65, then they cannot take those extra years of retirement, because that would destroy the solvency of pension systems, of old age health care, of social support, and all the rest. So age 65 has to go. There are much better ways of estimating old age than this old indicator. Also, it's very important when talking about total fertility, which is a very handy measure, as we all know, to remember that it is only a snapshot and assumes that things will remain as they are, that the same age-specific fertility rates of women current at the present time will persist into the future, and they almost certainly won't. And they'll be particularly vulnerable to changes in timing, as you all know, I'm sure. Delaying fertility takes down the total fertility, but that is misleading you about the size of completed family, and likewise having babies earlier pushes it up, but nonetheless that does not necessarily mean that the completed family size will be any different. So beware of all these things. You won't need, this audience won't need me to tell you that, but I think it's important to keep it in mind. And this is just an example of what happens when you adjust total fertility for questions of timing and questions of parity. That is to say, the number of children being born. You get a rather more favourable picture for Korea this is for 2015, of 1.5 children, not 0.78 children, as you see in the contrast between the blue line in the middle and the dotted, the broken line at the bottom. Nonetheless, it's still not entirely satisfactory. Immigration. I've been asked several times, what about immigration? Immigration indeed can preserve the size of the population. This is a very simple question of elementary arithmetic. What it cannot easily do, what it can't do at all, is to preserve the age structure in the long run. If the fertility rate is below the level of replacement in a population, then you cannot maintain the ratio of young population to elderly population by means of migration without increasingly large numbers of migrants every year, which lead, of course, to eventually to population growth, which may not be desirable, but will certainly lead to the eventual replacement of the population receiving the migrants by a population descended from the new migrants. That is simply elementary arithmetic and is well understood. So you can sort of preserve the age structure, but only by constantly increasing levels of migration and also by the replacement of the original population with an urban descendant one in the long run. The United Nations, as you probably know, produced some rather ingenious calculations in the year 2000, which worked out how many migrants you would need in various countries to preserve the age structure at its current level from the year 2000 to the year 2050. And in the case of Korea, the number turned out to be, I think it was 6.8 billion, which was quite close to the total population of the world at that time, which meant that all us foreigners had to pack our bags and come here in order to save you from population aging. Clearly absurd. This is just an example of what happens in a country like Britain, which has a birth rate below replacement, but quite close to it, or had at that time. This is a projection of ethnic change from the year 2006 to 2056, with net immigration of 180,000 people per year and a total fertility of 1.84. As you can see from the top line, the proportion of the, what you might call the native population, continually declines. The population of immigrant descent continually increases. This is even assuming that the birth rate will decline in the immigrant population, and by about the year 2070, the immigrant descended population will become the majority. That depends, of course, like all projections, on those assumptions holding true. And you may or may not think this matters. Nonetheless, it's something to be kept firmly in mind. Sorry, it's very sensitive. Yes. Well, if you look around the world, can we see anything slightly resembling the East Asian Korean situation, which might give us some clue as to what's going on? And you can, sort of, if you look at the southern European countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, then you will find that the pattern of total fertility is not dissimilar to that of East Asia, even though it is typically a little bit higher. Here we have the unweighted means of the southern European countries in red and the unweighted means of the East European countries, East Asian countries in blue. And they were quite similar to each other for some decades, although they're now diverging. What have they got in common? Can we learn something from this? Well, maybe we can. This is just some detail to show how those four southern European countries have converged. and become really quite similar to each other. This is a phenomenon that strikes me as being very interesting in different groups of countries throughout the world. But I'm using an average. What have they got in common? Well, a number of things. One of them is a set of social attitudes which Banfield has called amoral familism. Now, this is a controversial notion, by no means universally accepted, describing social traditions which give primacy to responsibilities and duties of the family, and which correspondingly give little attention to responsibilities to people fellow citizens who are not family members. In such systems, large numbers of people are recognized as being family and responsibility assumed for them, and also duties expected from them at the same time. What this tends to do is to work, from the point of view of fertility, is to work perfectly well as long as traditional patterns of responsibility of men and women are being followed. The men breadwinners, the women looking after the family. In traditional society, that works fine. But once society starts to modernize, once women have the chance of moving into the more educated levels of the workforce, once women start to become educated at university and so on, this system doesn't work, because all the family duties which families load onto women, of course, a lot of the family are naturally done by women. Who else? Certainly not by men. It is women who do the cooking, the cleaning, looking after the babies, and also very often in Southern Europe, looking after other relatives as well, who may live with the family or may live close by. This is not a situation which we're familiar with very much in northwestern Europe. It is much more typical of the south. The consequence is that unless something happens, women get overloaded. And noble creatures that they are, they try and do their best, but they must exercise portion control in these very widely ranging responsibilities, including portion control over family size. And so you tend to get low birth rates as a consequence of that. And that particularly applies in the case of Korea, with the strong emphasis on educational success of children, where, of course, again, it is women, I understand, who spend their lives shuttling children backwards and forwards after school to private crammers, where they strive to excel their peers and get into the best colleges with the best exam grades. What about former high fertility countries? What about anything to emulate in other parts of the world? Do we have anything to learn from Denmark, France, New Zealand, the US, Norway, and the UK, which you can see here? Well, I think we probably have. One of the points which is interesting, I think, is that these countries, with one exception, have never had very low levels of fertility. In the UK, for example, until very recently, total fertility has never gone below 1.6. In many of the other European countries, fertility has never gone below even 1.7. So the history is quite different from that in East Asia. We haven't had these crises assailing us for the last 20 or 30 years of ultra-low birth rates. What can we find, perhaps, that might help us to work out what to do in the case of East Asian low fertility? Well, what's happened there? Before the Second World War, there were certainly problems to do with the low birth rate. Both Germany and France became very alarmed at the way that their population fertility was declining, partially because, of course, they were always expecting to be at war with each other, were interested in the size of the number of recruits to the armed forces. This was a really serious concern in France, which, of course, lost its war against Germany in 1870 and almost lost its war against Germany in the First World War, and again lost again in 1940. So a very real fear, although by no means just demographic in its causation. there were lots of pro-natalist initiatives there which were not really sufficiently scientific to be able to evaluate it properly, but may well have worked for a little while in Germany, and which in 1939 in France really has set in train the only comprehensive and consistent family support policy in Europe of any duration. That has given many aspects of the French state a character of supporting the family in terms of taxation, in terms of entitlements for parents of large families, and there large families means 3 children or more, in terms of costs, in terms of transport, in very comprehensive schooling for very young children at state expense, a whole variety of topics in France, which seems to be very successful. And my French colleagues tell me that one of the most important aspects of this set of policies, which has been evolving since 1939, is that it is consistent. It doesn't matter who is the president. It doesn't matter which is the ruling political party. French men and women know that this policy of supporting the family will be consistent no matter who is in charge at the Elysee. This is very important, as opposed to having an erratic, changing policy of an unpredictable kind. Something similar is true in Sweden, and it's important to realize there that the Swedish approach to fertility or to family welfare was just as much concerned with getting married women with children into the workforce as it was with getting people, women who were working, to have children. It was a workforce-oriented, economic-oriented policy to remove the obstacles, to prevent women at home with children going to work. And of course, if you remove those obstacles to help people who are at home with the children to go to work, then you are also helping people who are at work, women who are at work, to have children. It works in both ways. That's part of the origin of the Swedish system. It is not by any means just to do with the birth rate, it's to do with the economy and the workforce. In Germany, the problem was greatly exacerbated by the excesses of the Nazi period, which was rigorously pro-natalist, successfully so for a while. But the Nazi regime didn't last long enough to see what the result would be. The result of the Nazi regime, of course, in the end was disastrous war and defeat, which brought all of that to an end. In Britain, as usual, we bumbled along, doing nothing in particular. We started to get worried, like the rest of Europe, in the 1930s, set up a royal commission, a very excellent royal commission, which reported with great demographic technique improvement in 1946. By that time, the baby boom had arrived, people like me were being born, the problem had solved itself, and required no further action, and there was then and still is no policy to increase fertility in Britain. The only one policy was to try and bring down the deplorably high level of teenage pregnancy, and that succeeded. So that wasn't to do with increasing the birth rate. Again, can we find some parallel with Northwestern Europe in terms of the birth rate? Well, we can. If you look at the so-called neo-Europes overseas, sometimes called the Anglosphere, that is to say, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. What happens to their birth rates? Their birth rates have been consistently higher than those of the UK, consistently higher than the majority in Western Europe, and have become quite convergent, as you see, with those of Northwestern Europe, more convergent over time. And they share particular characteristics, most of the countries overseas. They have lots of space, they have a policy of expanding the population, but not particularly encouraging the birth rate. They haven't got to. it's always been reasonably satisfactory until very recently. One of the things which is perhaps similar in northwestern Europe and the Anglosphere overseas is the absence of very specific population or fertility increasing policies in those countries, because the normal basic situation in terms of gender relations, workforce and so on is reasonably consistent with birth rates which are adequate, if not entirely ideal. But they're all a replacement, of course, with the occasional exception of New Zealand. So here are some of the contrasts, I think, between that group which has what you might call reasonably successful fertility performance on the one hand, and East Asia, where performance is distinctly under par. In East Asia, one of the things that really strikes people like me is the contrast between the meteoric economic growth of countries like Korea, which started off from nothing in 1950, national income no higher than that of a poor African country, and the tremendous increase in material prosperity of every kind up to the present day. And that, comparing that with the often rather glacial pace of social change, particularly that, if I may say so, relating to the position of women in society and in the workforce and in education. That is an enormous comparison. Whereas these processes were much slower and more gradual, both in Western Europe and in the European countries of European descent overseas. In East Asia, we have this very superior education. You have little immigration and usually very small minority populations, quite unlike the recent history in the English-speaking world, where the reverse is the case. The social modernization in East Asia has been really very partial. Some aspects of the so-called second demographic transition have proceeded at pace, like, for example, divorce and late childbearing, late marriage, and so on. Others have not. There is no history of marriage being avoided, whereas in northwestern Europe there is a long tradition of about 20% of women never marrying and about 20% of women remaining childless, going back to the 16th century. That doesn't exist here, as far as I'm aware. And one thing which is particularly noteworthy is the way in which the context of fertility is so very different in these countries, comparing the Anglosphere and the countries of European descent overseas. That is to say that cohabitation is modest and the proportion of births outside marriage is tiny. About 3% or so, although recently increasing, as you all know better than I do. I think this is very important because it means that women can't do it their way. If they want children, they have got to be married. Marriage, given the high work emphasis of Korean and other East Asian society, sometimes, it would seem, not very attractive. Again, I say this on the basis of what I've been told and what I have read, and not what, of course, I have experienced. The prevalence of amoral familism, which I mentioned before, very typical of Southern Europe, apparently similarly a bit typical of East Asia, is not so prominent in northwestern Europe. Quite the contrary, there's all this painful desire to avoid it. And as well as this strong so-called workism, there is also this, what appears to be, unique examination mania, which drives, as I know from what my own students, Korean students, have told me, drives students to extraordinary levels of hard work, drives their parents, particularly their mothers, to extraordinary devotions of time, conveying them when they were younger to crammers, and in order to get the best possible results, to get into the best possible colleges, to get into the best possible jobs. That seems to be very much at the expense of leisure and work-life balance, which I think has its effects, in part, on the birth rate. Here's some data which you'll be familiar with, very low levels of births outside marriage. And the graph which follows, I think, shows that this is back in 2009. As a rule of thumb, I'm not saying this is a recommendation, as a rule of thumb, there were no countries which had a reasonably high total fertility, let's say 1.6, which did not also have at least 30% of births outside marriage. There were no countries where the birth rate was at an acceptable level, 1.6 or so above that, and where most births were inside marriage. They just didn't exist. This remains mostly true in 2021. The general birth rate has gone down, yes, but that quarter is still empty, with the exception of Montenegro. I feel I abolished Montenegro because it interfered with my generalization. But apart from Montenegro, there's no country is in that quarter where a birth rate is reasonably high and where most births are inside marriage. There's no such country. Very important to remember, before we get too gloomy, the birth rates can go up as well as down, and have done so on several occasions in Europe. They did so after the Second World War. They did so after the decline of fertility in the 1970s, and they did so most recently. As recently as 2010, total fertility in England and Wales was 1.94, which is quite reasonable. I've been very happy with that. It's now down to 1.53, so the fact that it goes down does not stop it going up as well. And some examples of that are in the countries, the former communist countries, in the former Soviet Union, the FSU, and Central and Eastern Europe, where, as you see, fertility collapsed after the end of communism, and all the props to keep fertility high were removed by the economic and political collapse, and now they've crawled back into a reasonable level, in some cases even as far as 1.6, by becoming, as it were, what you might call more normal countries. And here are some individual examples which I won't dwell on. This is just a summary of the Central and Eastern European system. So I think we can take some consolation from that recovery, even though the result has only been a recovery up to 1.5, 1.6, which is not really quite as high as we would like, as you might imagine. Should we expect birth rates to increase in the long run and recover from all these possibly temporary setbacks? The thing to which I cling to is the fact that desired family size in most countries, most developed countries, most of the time, still remains around 2 children. Although there's an alarming tendency for this to slip a bit. Achieved family size, by contrast, is just between 1 and 1.8. And so the great question, as I said before, is find out why this gap exists. Find out what are the obstacles preventing families, especially women, achieving the number of children whom they say they would like to have. There used to be an assumption that the end of the demographic transition would be a recovery to the previous position of homeostasis between birth and death rates, so that the population would neither grow nor increase, and the birth rate would be quite high. That hasn't happened yet, but I think it's rather likely in the long run, but that's not something which I can prove. There's a danger, on the other hand, of falling into Wolfgang Lutz's low fertility trap. That is to say, if the birth rate remains low for a long period of time, it becomes normalized. People get used to the experience of very small families, just 1 child, or at most 2, very small numbers of cousins and other collateral relatives. And if that becomes internalized into the culture, then you may be in trouble. And finally, the general reduction of the birth rate in many countries is a matter of some concern and is not properly understood. Even those countries which had high birth rates are now having lower birth rates. I think that there are some rational reasons for this, and it's important to realize that not all countries are affected. The French total fertility is still 1.8. There is much more emphasis on work in Europe nowadays for all sorts of economic reasons, which is regrettable. We've had economic crises in 2008. We've had the COVID crisis from 2019. We've had a Ukraine war from 2022. All good reasons, both for economic damage and for reasons of confidence in the future, why birth rate should be low, and I think temporarily low. I'm very surprised that it did not recover. Demographers have been scratching their heads about this, as these comments from two notable demographers, Anne Gauthier and Wolfgang Lutz, emphasize. They're scratching their heads and wondering what's going on, given that Northwestern Europe, anyway, ought to retain higher birth rates. There's no obvious reason why it should go quite as low as it has done. What can corporations do? Well, this is something which I'm not used to thinking about, because in Britain, business has nothing to do with the birth rate. In Korea, things are different. And it seems to me that there is a scope here, if it can be faced, to greatly improve the quality of family life by persuading individuals to work less and persuading corporations to encourage them to work less. The government has, in the past, tried to do this with legislation. The present government has tried to increase the number of hours worked per week, which seems to me to be rather perverse and unhelpful. There's got to be some way in which corporations, being so important in Korea, have a role to play here. I've set out some things here which might be possible, which would require, in some cases, legislation, a certain amount of force. I think quotas may have been already tried to promote women. Well, if so, try harder, because it doesn't appear to have worked. So that's all possible. But can you actually change culture in this way? Oh, the suggestion is, I'm sorry, I keep skipping. There are examples where culture change can be encouraged by legislation, by the spread of new norms, and so on. Three examples here. In the distorted sex ratio in Korea. Korea is a country which has succeeded in removing the distorted sex ratio, which was so harmful and would be so harmful were it to continue, as the graph indicates. And that was a mixture, I understand, of government action, of public opinion change, of political pressure of various kinds, and a spread of new norms among the public. A very successful example of great demographic importance. Road deaths in France. Driving in France used to be a bit of a nightmare. Lovely roads, lovely country, but mad drivers, and who paid no attention to the speed limits. Much more serious emphasis upon road safety and speed limits have taken the deaths per year down from 11,000 to 2,500 in a very short space of time. And finally, smoking in public places in Britain and elsewhere has been banned. No one thought this would work. Of course, people have to smoke, but they don't anymore. In restaurants, public houses, theatres, cinemas, all smoke-free. Universities, all smoke-free. And the last thing which has been achieved by nudging and persuasion is something simple, but nonetheless very unappealing. People are persuaded to clear up after their dogs. In the past, this was not done, and the pavements were disgusting. Nowadays, it's very much frowned on to let your dog foul the pavement. Everyone goes around with a dog with one of these in their pocket in order to clear up unpleasant objects on the pavement and prevent people going. And it's thought disgraceful not to do it. Lots of examples, therefore, of culture change, which can be successful. So, conclusions. Improving measurement, important, but doesn't make much difference. Salvation through migration, no. a basic question to do with culture change. Given that Korean women are behaving more like men in terms of their performance in the workforce, their educational level, then in order to look after children and the household, it's imperative that men behave more like women, how attractive this may be to gentlemen in Korea. And this means more support for families, irrespective of family type, making cohabitation and births to cohabiting couples much more easy, changing the registration system and all that. Discouraging insecure unemployment is something which the corporations could do, and limiting working hours. And somehow getting rid of examination mania. I don't see where it gets you in the long run. How you do that, I don't know, either improving public schools, taxation, quotas, I don't know. But whatever you do, if I may say so, it's got to be consistent and enduring. It's got to be shared between different political parties. So like in France, doesn't matter who's in power, people have faith that their families will be supported. If that isn't done, then, if I may say, and on a frivolous note, fertility may go to the dogs. Going to the dogs is an expression in English meaning that things are getting worse and will collapse. East Asian fertility does require positive action. And on that note, I will finish. And thank you very much for your patience.
I'm Bobo Kai, an associate professor in sociology at Coleman University, and I'm very happy to be here to listen to Professor David Coleman's inspiring talk and have an opportunity to discuss about his talk. As we listen to him, he laid out key issues in the role of fertility in Korea from the comparative perspective. So I'm going to talk about some of the empirical evidence related to this talk in Korea and some theoretical speculation related to his talk. Okay. So first, I'm going to present several findings related with the measurement of the population changes in Korea, focusing on the changes in marital fertility and prospective measures of the population aging. And secondly, I'm going to briefly discuss about some theoretical issues in low fertility in Korea, something like mismatches between the desired and the realized fertility, and the implications of non-marital fertility, and finally, role of the private corporation in the extremely low fertility context. Let me show you some of the graphs I produced last year with some of my colleagues. Because of the non-marital fertility is very low in Korea, examining the trend of marital fertility can provide the useful insight to understand Korean fertility decline. And this graph on the screen shows the result of the decomposition of the TFR change, fertility change, into the changes in marriage rate and marital fertility rate. According to this graph, TFR in Korea after 2001 would have risen between 2001 and 2015 if the share of married women remained the same as in 2001, but would have declined since 2015. This means that the marital fertility increased between 2001 and 2015, but decreased afterwards. So from this analysis, we can see that the extremely low fertility in Korea, now like TFR below 1.0, is a consequence of the decline in marital fertility since 2015 and combined with continuing decline in marriage. And this graph shows the same pattern, shows the duration-based TFT, total marital fertility rate, which is the sum of the duration-specific marital fertility rate for the sake of the time. I'm not going to talk about the detail of this measure, but this measure shows is known as the robust tempo change in the fertility. So this analysis also confirmed that the marital fertility declined since 2015. So we may conclude that the extremely low fertility, like TFR under 1.0, is consequence of driven by the changes in marital fertility or recent marital fertility after 2015. And Professor Coleman also talked about some of the alternative measures of the population aging using remaining life expectancy. So this graph shows the changes in the ages at remaining life expectancy equal to 15. So we see that from this graph that the age at remaining life expectancy equal 15 continues to rise in Korea. So currently, this is over 70, or like 72 or 73, much higher than the usual old age threshold of the age 65. So, using this alternative criterion to define the old, the trend of population aging in Korea looks quite different. The graph on the left side using the traditional threshold of the old age, age 65, and the right-hand side graph shows that the alternative measure of the defining the old. We can see that the share of the old people will increase much slower pace in the prospect age perspective, is shown in this graph on the right-hand side. And consequently, the same pattern can be found in the old age dependency ratios. This graph shows that the trend seems quite different depending on the measure of age. But the bottom line is that the Korean population is aging in the very fast pace, regardless of using the prospective measure or the traditional measure. So, as Professor Coleman mentioned, the better measure of the population aging may kind of show some better picture, but not solve the problem. Let me discuss about some conceptual or theoretical issues about the low fertility in Korea mentioned by Professor Coleman's talk. Demographers typically understand below replacement level fertility, low fertility, as a consequence that people fail to achieve their desired family size. However, given the sustained TFR below 1.0 in Korea, like over 5 years, we may speculate that people's attitude may change fundamentally. So many people just do not want children. So they are not failing their desire, but their desire is also very low. So in this sense, we may say that people may not pursue small family, but they just pursue no family. So we may need to reconsider this kind of conceptual framework, like a failure of desired family to address the low fertility issue. Unfortunately, I don't know how we can approach this issue, but the sustained below low, extremely low fertility kind of warrant this kind of traditional framework. And that graph is from the Professor Coleman's talk. So the slide kind of has some. So that there are some problems in the slide. Yeah. So we see that this is presented by the Professor Coleman shows that low non-marital fertility seems to be and is partly responsible for the low fertility in East Asia. However, the relationship may not be causal. So some other factor may are working here. So this means that increasing non-marital fertility may not be the solution to the low fertility. So this may not increase the TFR. So we should look for some other causes that affect the low fertility and the low non-marital fertility. So their relationship may not be supported. I'm not sure what are these causes, but we should be cautious in interpreting this kind of pattern. Finally, Professor Coleman seems somewhat doubtful about the role of of the private companies in coping with low fertility. Lebanese private corporations are key players in family balance. There is an interesting Korean case in this regard. A large corporation implemented mandatory parental leaves for the fathers. Within 3 months of the birth, 1 month of full payment of salary and operating at the school. And the result shows that participants in this program developed a new identity as a working dad, like a working mother. Although these may not be an option for the many small corporations, this example shows that the private corporations may be able to contribute to coping with low fertility. These are what I prepared for today, and thank Professor Coleman and the Institute for giving me the chance to participate in this valuable event. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for inviting me to such a great discussion with distinguished professors. Professor Coleman accurately understands Korea's situation and identified the cases of the low fertility rate based on European examples. He also suggested necessary social changes for the future. I believe it is the role of the policy sector to incorporate the proposed suggestions into the policy. So here I would like to discuss the population outlook in Korea and the recent sharp decline in the birth rate and fiscal policies, and like to add a few more questions to Professor Coleman. I'd like to start with a very familiar picture. In terms of population, Korea is the fastest shrinking country. While the number of births has been lower than the number of deaths, the population has been declining for the past 14 months consecutively. According to the population projection by Statistics of Korea, the total population peaked already in 2020 as around 52 million and will be under 30 million by 2090. Professor Coleman predicted in 2006 that Korea would become the first country facing population decline. At the time, the annual number of births was 430,000, and the projected number of births for 2022 last year was 375. But as you can see in the figure in the right, the actual number of births last year was 249,000. It means the situation gets worse. The outlook has been also ever-falling. Statistics of Korea has conducted 4 projections since 2011, but the actual TFI figure fell below the projections every time. If I pick a projection year, say year 2021, in the projection of 2011, the birth rate was projected as 1.35. It was 1.25 in 2016 projection and 0.86 in 2019 projection. But the actual birth rate for 2021 was, as we all know, 0.81, which is lower than all the previous estimates. But looking ahead, further decline is forecast in short term down to 0.7. It means we continue to set new records in our history. The recent decline is expected to have a structural effect on the mid to long-term fertility rate. It will be rebound anyway, I hope. However, what is noteworthy here is with each projection, the level of long-term fertility rate has been declining as well. For example, in the 2011 projection, the long-term fertility rate was projected to 1.42, but in next projection, it decreased to 1.38, and then it dropped to 1.21 in the recent projection. It means that if the short-term fertility rate drops significantly, even with a rebound, the long-term fertility rate is expected to remain low. So it is crucial to prevent the birth rate further down. Professor Coleman warned that every time he had visited Korea, the birth rate declined. And I worry the warning will be true this time as well, based on the number of marriages last year. Since most births are attributed to married couple in Korea, marriage can be seen as a precursor to childbirth. Last year, number of births and number of marriages hit their all-time low. The number of births has decreased to 1/4 of the peak, and the number of marriages has decreased by more than half. If we see in more recent years after 2019, the number of marriages decreased faster than number of births. So in long term, the fertility rate has been affected more, but in recent years, the decline in marriages seems to affect more. The causes of the decline in marriages are similar to those of declining birth rate. There are economic, social, and cultural factors such as housing cost, employment security, and high competition also have a complex impact on marriage rate, we guess. In January of this year, NAPO published a report to estimate the impact of a marriage decline. According to our analysis, 76% decline in births was attributed to the decrease in marriages. There are more details of estimating the impact of low births in the report, but I briefly explain here. We estimate the number of newborn by applying the actual birth rate of newlywed by marriages from 2019 to 2022. After fixing the size of newlyweds by marriage year in 2019, and then the difference of actual figure and scenario is the impact of birth drops of a marriage decline. That is, the message is the number of births this year expected to reach a record low. In fact, according to the population trend survey released last month, the number of births in the first 2 months of this year was the lowest ever recorded. So based on our analysis, it's evident that the impact of marriages is significant. Therefore, in policies aimed at overcoming low birth rate, it is crucial to consider marriage factor in addition to support childbirth and childcare. I will talk a little bit about the fiscal policies now. In terms of fiscal policy, we haven't neglected this issue. For the 5-year plan of low birth and aging basic plan, we are in first stage as of 2023, and which page birth rate has worsened and related fiscal projects have been expanded. So since 2006, the total cumulative budget was 332 trillion won. And I will provide a more specific breakdown of how the budget has been used. In a seminar held in National Assembly last month, the Budget Assembly Department of NABO presented the program evaluation results. The budget for addressing low birth rate can be divided into child-rearing household support and family-friendly environment promotion. In the early stage, most of the budget has been for child-rearing household support, which is presented by blue bar in the graph. However, recently, there has been a significant increase in family-friendly environmental promotion, represented by the orange bar in the graph. Now let's take a closer look at the budget allocation by policy categories. The largest proportion was allocated to housing-related policy, about 46%. The second largest was child care support policies, and then cash-based support such as child allowances. Additionally, there were programs for community center, maternal protection, and job stability, and among others. Let's compare Korea's public spending on families with that of OECD countries. Based on the most recent data available from 2019, Korea's budget for family support as a percentage of GDP is not high relatively. The average of OECD was 2.29%, while Korea spent 1.56%. It is the figure of 2019, while it's slightly lower than Japan. In terms of cash-based support, Korea expenditure is low as well. Cash-based support includes child allowances, maternity leave benefit, among others. However, countries like France, Germany, and Sweden, which have higher fertility rate than Korea, allocate a higher proportion of their overall budget for low birth rate to cash-based support. And here are my additional questions to Professor. And the birth rate of Korea is projected to fall further moving forward, as I showed in slide 3. In this crisis, which policies have more priority in the short term? And which will be the long-term mission? And many countries in Europe are paying childcare benefit in cash. How do you think about the effectiveness of cash support? And as you shown that there are a little drops in European countries' fertility rate, so is there any change in public spending on families? If not, is it universal phenomenon from the increased life expectancy? And I'd like to end my discussions with this picture, The Boss Baby. This movie was released in 2017, and it started from the low fertility issue. So I'd like to say it is already universal theme in the world. So I'd like to say our low birth rate is based on two factors. One is universal and one is Korea-specific factor. So the policy for low birth rate should consider both factors together. And thank you.